Part 5, Section 1, Chapter 4 of Short History of the Christian Church by John Fletcher Hurst. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. The English Colonization, Virginia and Massachusetts. England was profoundly impressed by the Spanish discoveries in America. Her rulers and her sailors were alike anxious, from different motives, to gather into the British domain whatever treasures and territory the New World might give them. It was a European race for gold, for furs, for land. So far, Spain had the advantage. But the Anglo-Saxon, in all modern history, has been the king of circumstance. 4 years after Columbus knelt on the shore of the little island of San Salvador and raised the cross, John Cabot sailed from England westward to reach China. Henry VII. Had given him authority to discover unknown lands and incorporate them with the British Isles. When he sailed for China, he touched the bleak shore of Labrador. On a second voyage he discovered Newfoundland and the New England coast, and skirted the Atlantic coast down to Florida. Other English discoverers followed in his bold ocean pathway. Martin Frobisher, Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Captain John Smith, Sir Walter Raleigh, and Georget. Sir Humphrey Gilbert was lost at sea, and shortly before his death he was heard to say, "We are as near heaven by sea as by land." Wherever these discoverers went, they laid claim to the land in the name of the British crown. It was little concern whether Spain or France had already claimed it. The future would decide which was the abler to hold and colonize. The first stage in development was to colonize. The James River Colony was the first attempt at permanent occupation. This colony consisted of English cavaliers, devoted adherents to the established church. The colonists arrived in Virginia and settled on the bank of James River in 1607. The easy-going, gentlemanly element predominated. Of the 105 colonists, only 12 were tillers of the soil. The leader was John Smith. The Church of England was established as the ecclesiastical body. It was required that each male over 16 years of age should pay annually 10 pounds of tobacco and 1 bushel of corn for the support of the clergy. As new settlements should be formed, lands must be set apart for the incumbent. Tithes were afterwards instituted. None but ministers episcopally ordained could officiate in the colony. The laws of the colony were fully as severe as those of the Puritan colony at the north. The Reverend Robert Hunt accompanied the first expedition, and he labored with commendable zeal for the spiritual welfare of the colonists. Alexander Whitaker was a later apostle. It was through his influence that Pocahontas was converted. A noble purpose to convert the Indians was thwarted by an attempted massacre of the whites, March 1622. Very soon there arose trouble in the little body. John Smith had his enemies, and they were not slow to express their hostility. One of the members of this colony was Sandys, who wrote the first English work ever produced in the Western Hemisphere, a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses. By trouble with the Indians, by depletion through disease, and from other causes, the colonists were reduced to great need, and but for a timely reinforcement would probably have become extinct. The first stage of difficulty having passed, the period of earnest practical work began. John Smith wrote back to England a letter disabusing the public mind of its dream of gold from Virginia by saying, "Nothing is to be expected thence but by labor." Corn was planted, houses were built, tobacco fields were cultivated, and in 15 years the number of colonists, increased by later energetic arrivals, numbered 500 people. The Plymouth Colony arrived in 1620 at Cape Cod. These men were the boldest, most original, and most devout of all the organized colonies which landed on the American shore. The Pilgrims were revolutionists in the highest moral sense. The little company of Brownists, who were separatists from the established church, sailed from Scrooby, in Lincolnshire, England, for Holland, intending to make that country their permanent abode. They remained in Amsterdam 1 year, then went to Leyden, and lived 12 years, where they had a church of 300 communicants, and finally determined to try their fortunes in the New World. Or, as Canning has said, they turned to the New World to redress the balance of the Old. 2 of their number, Robert Cushman and John Carver, were sent to England to secure a patent to unite with the Virginia colony. A patent seems to have been received, but it did them no good. The Pilgrims left Leyden for England, and set sail from Plymouth in the Mayflower and the Speedwell. The latter vessel proved unseaworthy, and returned. The Mayflower crossed the ocean, and on November 9th, 1620, she dropped anchor at Cape Cod. The next month they removed permanently from Cape Cod and settled on the western side of Massachusetts Bay, where they built a town and called it Plymouth, after the last place which they had left in England. John Robinson had been the pastor in Leyden. He remained in Europe, but comforted his flock by sympathetic administration until they sailed, and by pastoral letters after their departure. Robinson is a man to be held in everlasting remembrance. More than any other man, he is the founder of independency as a developed system. A graduate of Cambridge, he was a man of liberal spirit and broad views. He was one of the heralds of toleration. He acknowledged the Church of England as a true church, and he admitted the Dutch Christians to communion. When the Pilgrims were leaving Delftshaven, he told them that he bewailed the state and condition of the Reformed churches, which had come to a period in religion and could go no further than the instruments of their Reformation, Luther and Calvin." God had "more truth to break forth from his word," and they should be ready to receive that further light. "It was not possible that the Christian world should come so lately out of such thick anti-Christian darkness, and that full perfection of knowledge should break forth at once." It was no doubt due to his liberal counsels that the Plymouth Colony, the Old Colony, as it has often been called, was never rent with such fierce divisions, nor persecuted dissentients with such ruthless rigor as the later colony of Massachusetts Bay. The Plymouth colonists suffered from disease, the inroads of the Indians, and the scarcity of food. They "knew not at night where to have a bit in the morning." The first winter they buried 1/2 of their little company of 110 under the snow. One of the noblest members of this band was William Brewster, their ruling elder, who had spent his fortune in aiding his brethren, and had set up a printing press in Leyden, where he published many theological works. He was the soul of the band, encouraging them, and on Sundays preaching to them. Not being ordained, he never administered the sacraments, and was superseded by the coming of the first regular minister, William Ralph, in 1629. The colony of Massachusetts Bay was secured by the English Puritans in 1629. Probably Charles I would never have granted this Puritan request but for its character, permission to leave his realm. Then, too, he may have been influenced by the fact that James I, in November, 1620, had granted a charter to 40 persons for a belt of territory between the 40th and 48th degrees of north latitude, extending from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This charter had been dissolved, and the new charter for Massachusetts Bay might safely take its place. Winthrop, with a company of 800 men, was the Massachusetts leader. He said, "I shall call that my country where I may most glorify God and enjoy the presence of my dearest friends." The Massachusetts men consisted of the middle class of English Puritans. Some were lawyers and members of other learned professions. Others were good farmers, men of large landed estates, Oxford scholars, and divines. Among the clergy were such intellectual giants as Cotton, Hooker, and Roger Williams. We must remember the difference between the Pilgrim colony of 1620 and the Puritan colony of 1628. The Pilgrim Fathers were Congregationalists, out-and-out Separatists, who believed the Church of England to be Antichrist and still involved in the toils of popery. They were irreconcilably opposed to any compromise with her. The Puritans, who came later, were members of the Church of England, who believed in and loved their dear mother Church, but who desired to see in her a more radical reform. They would not willingly break with the national Church, but they labored earnestly for a further reformation on the lines of the New Testament. This being the case, it is remarkable that, when out of the shadow of the Establishment, the Puritan immigration should have drifted of their own accord to substantial agreement on matters of church government with their more thorough brethren. For one thing, the spectre of Laud made them afraid of a polity that could arm itself with the terrors of a Star Chamber court. A body of 200 colonists was already established at Salem. Winthrop's men united with them. Some 700 more colonists followed in the wake of Winthrop's ships. There was no hope whatever for any favor in England. The whole trend of royal authority was against the Puritans. Archbishop Laud was persecuting all nonconformists, without even the pretense of mercy. The Puritans looked to America as probably their only safe asylum. It is safe to believe there was not a Puritan fireside in England at which the hope of going to America was not entertained. During the 10 or 11 years preceding the Long Parliament, not less than 200 ships left England, bearing towards the western world 20,000 Puritans. "Farewell, dear England," they said, as the English coast faded from their view, while Winthrop's followers wrote back to the less fortunate brethren, "Our hearts shall be fountains of tears for your everlasting welfare, when we shall be in our poor cottages in the wilderness." The amalgamation of the colonies of Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay was only a question of time. The two bodies differed essentially. The Plymouth men had no royal authority, were without charter, cared nothing for it, rejoiced in their independence, were outside of the Church of England, indeed, carried a free lance from the hour they left Scrooby for Holland. The men of Massachusetts Bay were a political body. The charter was to the Governor and Company of Massachusetts Bay in New England. They had large authority, and could admit new members on any terms they pleased. They professed strong attachment to the king, but enjoyed the liberty of an ocean between Massachusetts Bay and Charles I. We cannot be surprised that a serious question now arose. How would these two colonies stand related to each other? While Massachusetts Bay Colony had royal credentials and was of a greater number, the Plymouth Colony was older, had been making laws, expanding, studying the Indian character, organizing a church, developing, under Miles Standish, a military system, in fact, founding a nation. The smaller body gave strength to the larger. Whatever bonds held the Massachusetts men to dear England were now seen to be useless. In due time the two bodies were marvelously alike. All were separatists from the Establishment. All met together in ecclesiastical synods. The civil and the religious life became a unit. Little Plymouth had proved stronger than large Massachusetts Bay. At the organization of the Salem Church, the mother church of Massachusetts Bay, in 1629, when Skelton was ordained pastor and Francis Higginson preacher, the first ordination in New England, the church at Plymouth sent fraternal delegates who approved what was done and gave the right hand of fellowship. From that moment Congregationalism has been the historic polity of the New England churches. End of chapter 4.